Tonight, the search for Lynette Hooker has turned into a recovery effort. Lauren Kostick traveled to their hometown in Lenawee County as the family is searching for answers.
I was just sitting there in shock because I couldn't imagine this actually happening to her. I don't want to go forever just not ever finding her again.
The boat ride was supposed to take just a few minutes. It was supposed to be a routine short ride across the calm waters in the Bahamas. But sometime after sunset, in that small stretch of water, this woman, Lynette Hooker, disappeared. Her husband says she simply fell overboard. No warning, no struggle, no time to react. And then he was alone, drifting through the night. Who would believe that? But here's the problem. The water they were in isn't known for being dangerous. The distance they were traveling was short, and the person who vanished knew exactly how to handle herself on a boat. So how does someone like that just disappear? And why does the only witness have a story that's already raising questions? This is the case of Lynette Hooker, a 55-year-old woman who vanished during a routine boat ride in the Bahamas. At first, this story sounds like another tragic accident, but as investigators began looking closer, more details started to surface. Details that are shocking and suspicious from a delayed phone call, a night-long drift that doesn't quite add up, and a relationship that, behind the scenes, may not have been what it appeared to be. What happened in that short stretch of water, and what unfolded in the days after, may be just as important. We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything. That evening started like so many others. April 4th, 2026, Hopetown, a small, quiet settlement in the Abaco Islands of the Bahamas. As the sun began to set, boats moved slowly through the harbor. People finished dinner, the air calm, routine, familiar. That night, Lynette Hooker and her husband, Brian, had just left a restaurant near the water. They weren't going far. Their sailboat, Soulmate, was anchored just offshore. To get back, they needed to take a small dinghy, an 8-foot boat they used regularly to move between land and water. It was a short trip, the kind you don't think twice about. Just a few minutes across the Sea of Abaco, an area known for being relatively protected with calmer waters than the open ocean. They had done this before. So, nothing about that moment suggested anything unusual. But somewhere between the dock and their boat, something happened. According to Brian, her husband, the weather conditions had started to shift. He would later describe the water as choppy, the wind picking up as darkness approached, and then, in the middle of that short crossing, he says Lynette fell overboard. Just like that, with no warning. He claimed she was suddenly thrown from the dinghy, disappearing into the water almost instantly. There was no time to react, no chance to grab her. And then, another problem. Brian says Lynette had the ignition key, a small device that controls the motor. Without it, the boat wouldn't run. The engine stopped. And just like that, the dinghy was no longer moving under power. He says he tried to reach her, but within moments, he lost sight of her completely. The light was fading, and the water stretching out in every direction, and the person he had just been sitting beside was gone, left behind in the dark water. What should have been a routine trip was now something else entirely. Disappearance, and the only person who saw it happen was the one left alone in that boat. The question everyone is asking is that, if the trip was that short, and the water wasn't far from shore, how did everything go wrong so quickly? At this point, everything we know comes from one person, Brian Hooker. He says that after Lynette fell into the water, he tried to reach her.
The flotation cushion that we used to sit on the dinghy, right after she went in. But I couldn't tell if she got it or not. I'm never going to forgive myself.
But almost immediately, he claimed something else happened. The dinghy began to drift. According to him, the wind and current started pulling the boat away, separating him from the exact spot where Lynette had fallen. And with no engine, no way to quickly turn back, he says the distance between them grew fast. He described trying to get closer, trying to move the boat, but without power, there wasn't much he could do. And within moments, he says she was gone from view completely, not just out of reach, but out of sight. What followed is one of the most unusual parts of this entire case. Brian claims he spent the rest of the night alone, out on the water, drifting and paddling in the dark, and for hours. He would later estimate somewhere between 7 to 9 hours, moving slowly across the Sea of Abaco with no clear direction. No lights guiding him back to the sailboat, no sign of Lynette in the water. Just open space and time passing. He says he tried to make his way back, tried to find either the boat or land, but instead, he continued drifting, carried further away by the same conditions he said pulled him from Lynette. Eventually, sometime around 4 a.m., he claims he reached shore near Marsh Harbor. By then, the night was over. But Lynette was still missing. No rescue, no recovery. Just one version of events from the only person who was there. The question here will be that: how did he survive the night and make it to shore? Without help, and why didn't help come sooner? By the time Brian reached land, the night was over. He says he made it to shore sometime around 4 a.m. after hours alone in the water. At that point, Lynette had already been missing for hours. But what happened next is where this case started getting suspicious, because Lynette wasn't reported missing right away. There was no immediate alert, no urgent call for help in the middle of the night. Instead, time passed. Morning came and went. And it wasn't until much later that anyone outside of that night even knew something was wrong. Brian eventually contacted Lynette's family. But by then, nearly a full day had gone by, roughly 24 hours since the moment she was last seen. When the call finally came in, the information was limited. There was no clear sequence of events, no detailed explanation of what had happened on the water. Just the core claim that Lynette had fallen overboard and never resurfaced. For her family, the news didn't come with clarity. It came with confusion. Because in situations like this, time matters. Every hour counts in a search, and that first window, the one where rescue is still possible, had already passed. By the time authorities would begin looking, they weren't starting from the moment she disappeared. They were starting nearly a day behind, and for those closest to Lynette, that delay didn't sit right. You start asking yourself what happened during those missing hours, before anyone was told, and why did he waste time? Immediately, Lynette was finally reported missing. The situation moved out of private hands. Authorities in the Bahamas were notified, and a search operation began. The Royal Bahamas Police Force took the lead. Soon after, additional support came in from the U.S. Coast Guard, bringing more resources, more coverage, and more urgency to the effort. Search teams focused on the waters near Hopetown, the same stretch Lynette had been crossing that night. Boats moved through the area. Aircraft scanned from above. They followed the route Brian described, looked along the likely drift paths, expanded outward as time passed. But there was a problem. There was nothing to find. No confirmed sightings, no distress signals, no physical trace of where Lynette had entered the water. As the hours turned into days, the tone of the search began to change. And at first, the goal was rescue. The possibility, however slim, that she could still be alive. But as time passed with no results, that possibility began to fade, and the search quietly shifted from looking for someone to save to searching for someone to recover. The same waters were still being searched. Immediately, Lynette was finally reported missing. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the life Lynette was living. Because this wasn't a vacation. For Lynette and her husband, Brian, that water wasn't unfamiliar territory. It was home. The two of them had made a major decision not long before all of this. They sold their house, let go of most of what they owned, and moved full-time onto a sailboat, a vessel named Soulmate. From there, their life changed completely. Days were no longer built around routines on land, but around tides, weather, and movement. Traveling from place to place, docking, anchoring, moving again, living in close quarters, with very little separation between daily life and each other. Everything happened in the same space, and over time, that kind of lifestyle becomes its own rhythm. You learn the water, you learn how to move safely. Now you pay attention to small changes, wind, current, balance. By all accounts, Lynette understood that. She wasn't new to this. People who knew her described her as careful, aware of her surroundings, comfortable around boats. This wasn't someone stepping onto the water for the first time. This was someone who had chosen this life and adapted to it, which makes what happened that night harder to place. Because for someone familiar with boating, someone used to moving in and out of small vessels, falling overboard in a short, controlled trip isn't something that easily goes unnoticed, and it's not something that typically happens without a reason. Now, the question will be that, if she knew the water so well, how did she end up overboard? Looking at it from the husband's part. From the beginning, Brian Hooker has been consistent about one thing. He says this was an accident. According to him, what happened that night wasn't intentional. It was a combination of timing, conditions, and bad luck. He described the water as unsettled, the wind was picking up, and the waves were becoming harder to manage in a small dinghy. And in that moment, he says, Lynette lost her balance and went overboard. After that, he maintains he tried to reach her, tried to move back toward where she had fallen, but without the engine running, and with the wind pushing the boat, he says he was being pulled away, not by choice, but by the conditions around him. He has repeated that point more than once, that he didn't leave her behind. He was separated from her. In the days that followed, Brian began explaining his version of events to others. He shared maps of the area, marked out the route they had taken, showed where he believed Lynette had fallen, and how the drift might have carried him away. He also communicated with friends, sending messages describing what happened, answering questions, explaining how the night unfolded from his perspective. At the same time, he expressed something else, frustration, because while the search for Lynette was ongoing, he was being held by authorities for questioning. And looking at it from the husband's part. From the beginning, Brian Hooker has been consistent about one thing. He says this was an accident. According to him, what happened that night wasn't intentional. It was a combination of timing, conditions, and bad luck. He described the water as unsettled, the wind was picking up, and the waves were becoming harder to manage in a small dinghy. And in that moment, he says, Lynette lost her balance. Up to this point, the story depends heavily on one version of events: wind, waves, a sudden loss of control. But to understand whether that version holds, you have to look at where all of this happened. The Sea of Abaco isn't an open ocean. It's a stretch of water protected by surrounding islands, known among sailors as relatively calm and manageable. A place where people anchor, travel short distances, and move between shore and boat every day. It's often described as a safe harbor. Not completely still, but not the kind of environment where extreme conditions are expected without warning. On most days, the water remains moderate. Waves stay within a manageable range. Currents are predictable. Visibility, especially near shore, is usually clear. And the route Lynette and Brian were taking that night was short, a simple crossing within that protected area. The kind of trip that's done regularly, often without much concern, which is why the conditions Brian described, strong enough to separate him from Lynette, strong enough to carry him away for hours, start to draw attention. Because if the environment that night was anything like what's typical for that area, then something doesn't fully line up. And even if the wind had picked up, even if the water became rough for a moment, it raises another question. How does someone go overboard on such a short, controlled trip without a clear reason? If the conditions weren't extreme, what caused such a sudden fall? Also, up to this point, everything I've shared with you has been based on what was reported, what was described, and what could or couldn't be found in the water. But there is more. A few days after Lynette disappeared, something happened. On April 8th, 4 days after that night in the dinghy, Brian Hooker was taken into custody. Authorities in the Bahamas brought him in for questioning, and he was held for hours. During that time, investigators began going through the details, piece by piece, his timeline, the route he said they traveled, the conditions he described. They compared his statements to everything they were gathering: search data, weather reports, movement patterns. And somewhere in that process, the case stopped being treated as a simple accident. It didn't mean they had reached a conclusion, but it did mean they were looking at something more, the kind of shift that doesn't happen without reason. Brian remained in custody for several days, until April 13th, when he was released without charges, at least for the time being. But that didn't close the case. It didn't clear the situation, because even after his release, the investigation stayed open, and Brian was still considered a suspect, which leaves one question. Something in what investigators saw, or heard, or found, was enough to change how they viewed that night. What did investigators see that made them treat this as more than an accident? As the investigation continued, attention began to shift away from what was said and toward what could be measured. Because in a case like this, there's often something else present, something that doesn't rely on memory or interpretation. Data. Among the items recovered during the search was something small, but potentially significant: Lynette's Apple Watch. At first glance, it's just a personal device, but in situations like this, it can hold a record of movement, timing, even physical activity, moments that may have been captured without anyone realizing. Investigators began looking at what it might contain: location data, activity logs, possible indicators of when something happened and where. At the same time, they weren't relying on just one source. They began reviewing GPS data, mapping out routes, comparing positions and movement patterns tied to the boat, trying to rebuild the night, not from memory, but from digital traces, piece by piece, looking at when the dinghy moved, where it may have drifted, how long certain parts of the timeline actually lasted, and whether those details matched what had been described. Because unlike a statement, data doesn't adjust itself. It either aligns or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, that becomes something else entirely, something that needs explaining. At this point, the investigation was no longer just about what might have happened in the water. It was about whether the sequence of events could be confirmed at all. Will the data confirm what happened or reveal something else? By this point in the investigation, a lot has been said. A timeline has been described. Search efforts have come and gone. Evidence has started to surface. But despite all of that, one thing hasn't changed. Lynette Hooker has not been found. No confirmed location, no clear final moment, no definitive answer to what happened in the water that night. And as of now, no charges have been filed. The investigation remains open, which means the case is still sitting in that uncertain space between explanations and doubt. Because even with everything that's been gathered, there are still questions that haven't gone away. The exact moment Lynette entered the water is still based on one account. The delay before anyone was notified has never been fully clarified. And the conditions described that night, whether they match what actually happened, are still being examined. So the story remains incomplete. And with that, different possibilities still exist. It could have been an accident, a moment of imbalance, in the wrong place at the wrong time. It could have involved environmental factors, conditions that made a short trip turn into something dangerous. Or there could be something else, something that hasn't been fully uncovered yet. Because until there's a clear answer, every version of that night is still being weighed against the same unknown. What really happened in that short stretch of water that night? And will the full story ever be known? We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything.